All right. Good evening, everybody. So glad that you all came. I'm sure we'll have some stragglers, including my wife will be in after she gets done dropping off some children at the airport and everything. But anyway, we're super excited to have you here for our first discussion night during this sermon series. Something that we've tried to create from time to time during like the off season from circle groups is to create a time where we can discuss what we're teaching, what we're learning from, and but this season during our series, My Home, My Neighborhood, and My Church, I just, as in my conversations with individuals about our political climate, our cultural climate, and our response, trying to understand our response as followers of Christ. When that's kind of a question, right? How do we respond? Because it's such a big issue and it's very polarizing. It's a very difficult issue. Let's hear from other people. And so in future, I know for next week particularly, we'll have a panel of young adults that we've been talking to, and I'm really excited about that. But tonight, I'm really excited to have Adam Gustine, which many of you will remember. We were just talking that the last time Adam was here was in 2019, and shame on us that we haven't had him back since 2019, but Adam helped us as a congregation during interim period. And because it's been so long, Adam, I would love for you to share with the family here what's been going on with you and your family.
Are we recording this? Is this why we're doing this? All right, great. Because I probably can project, but if we're recording it, I'm happy to. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Lowell. I'm grateful to be back. Lowell has invited me back. I just wasn't able to do it, so it's on me. A lot has changed since 2019. I don't know if you guys remember, we had a pandemic. That was weird. I got bifocals. No, it's been a good 6 years. Lowell just asked me to share an update. We were just talking about this. My kids, who 6 years ago were pretty little, I'm going to have a senior at St. Joe, a sophomore at St. Joe, and a middle schooler at Holy Cross. And so we're right in the middle of college selection process, which is stressful. If anybody has any tips, I could use them because I have no idea what we're doing. I work at Notre Dame. I work at the Institute for Ethics and the Common Good at Notre Dame. We are an ethics institute. We think about, it does a lot of philosophy, it does a lot of theology, but it also does a lot of applied ethics. And so we have a tech ethics lab. We're thinking a lot about artificial intelligence, and we're thinking a lot about some of the topics we'll talk about tonight. We have a project that we're working on. What does love actually look like in action? In all the ways that people talk about making the world a better place, what does love look like when you put it into practice in the world? Which is a pretty wonderful thing to be able to get to wake up every day and do. So that's what I've been up to.
So I do want to hit on the work that you're doing at the university because it was very intriguing to me. And I'm thinking about like the mission trips that I've been on in the past, and even some of the mission trips that we do with our youth. Usually it's about every other year. But you describe the work that you do with the students at Notre Dame as immersive experiences. Could you share a little bit about, what is that about?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that goes back a long time. There's a big discussion in Christian colleges and in churches too about the merits of going on short-term trips. And a lot of times somebody will come back from a mission trip and they'll say something along the lines of, it changed me way more than I changed them. You've probably heard somebody say that. And I think in some ways in our program, we want to lean into that. 10 college students going someplace they've never been, if we're being honest, they're not going to change the world when they're doing that. They're also not in 1 week really living in solidarity with folks on the margins. There's a limit to what it is that happens when you participate in a trip like this. And so actually what we've tried to do, and I think that there's something for churches as well, is to say actually what we want, our task, we'll speak living stones, as living stones, here's where we are. Here's where God's put us to be part of what God's doing in the world. If we go somewhere else, we might be able to be of help, but really we're actually going to learn from the people who are doing what God's called them to do in their part of the world. And so we really look for exemplars, either organizations or folks that we can come alongside. We might be able to support them, but they're really going to help our students understand what it means to be a faithful person where they're planted. So we think a lot about what is, questions of calling and vocation and how all that sort of immersive experiences like that destabilize us. They destabilize us, but that means that we're actually able to sort of form new pathways in our brains, think about things a little bit differently when we're uncomfortable like that.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I ask about that is because I think, and that the idea of the stabilization is something that in my mind, and as we as leaders are thinking about, discipleship as a congregation, we think about the world that we live in, we might feel that way. We might feel like we're off center, we're off kilter, and how do I respond? And I think even in the midst of that, there are things that God is showing us if we'll pay attention. And so, getting into where we want to go tonight, in your book and in our conversations that we've had, you talk about faithful presence. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, you've spent years writing and teaching about what it means to be a people of peace. And we talked about, I mentioned that a bit Sunday in the very first sermon in this series. Why do you think this message is so critical right now in our cultural moment, in our homes, and in our neighborhoods?
Well, we could probably spend the rest of the night talking about this question. Right. I think we live in a time where you can get a lot of traction by turning people into enemies. That's probably not a novel idea. If you can turn someone into the opponent, turn someone into the enemy, then you can rally people around you pretty quickly. You create a lot of distance between an in-group and an out-group if you were to do that. I think that it's not only easy to do, I also think there's a unfortunate reality where that's sort of instinctual. I think that maybe it's a collective like flight or fight sort of thing. When we sense that that person over there is a threat to me, we might put up walls, but we also might attack. And I actually think this question about what does it mean for the church to be a faithful presence, or for a Christian to be a faithful presence in the world? I actually think it really comes down to this question of how we see the world. Yeah. And I'll say the church groups, the church traditions that I've been a part of my entire life would probably tell you that the world is either a threat or an opponent to the gospel. One of those two ideas. Now, this probably isn't true for everybody. It was at least true for me. The world out there, whatever that means, is a threat or an opponent to the gospel. But, if you were to build a church strategy based on the idea that the world's a threat or the world's your opponent, you might protest a lot. You might put up hateful signs. You might talk about why people are, bad, going to hell, et cetera, et cetera. You might put into practice the idea that that's my enemy over there. But the interesting thing, I think, about the gospel is that it challenges that idea of turning someone into the enemy, turning someone into the opponent. If faithful presence is the opposite of turning the world into an opponent, then my job is not to defeat anyone. I think this is the point I'm trying to make. My job's not to defeat the world. If I believe that the gospel's true, then Jesus has already defeated the powers of sin and death. That's different than the world. Yeah. So the powers of sin and death have been defeated by Jesus on the cross. My job is to live as his disciple in the world. Our job as the church is to live as his people in the world. And that means that we cultivate, we try to grow. I saw this garden over here. That's a new thing. I don't think that was here in 2019. That's cool. But we try to grow love in the world. And that is the thing that counters all the polarization that you're talking about, all the hateful rhetoric, all the dividing into groups and opponents and all of this kind of thing. What would happen if there was a people that were committed to growing love? And so to me, that's the difference. That's what faithful presence looks like. You know, to this point over here with this garden, one of the things that I think is really helpful to think about for churches is to think of ourselves, every church is a demonstration plot of God's kingdom. So a demonstration plot, I mean, I sort of grew up in farm country in Illinois, and when you would drive past, you know, the different seed companies and the different agricultural companies, they're going to put their signs on the side of the road so that when you're driving by, you know, okay, if you really knew the codes and everything, you would say, okay, I know what's being planted there, and you can look at it and judge for yourself whether or not it's productive, right? Is this growing well? Is this producing good fruit? Well, those seed companies aren't forcing the other farmers to plant their seed. Those seed companies are getting farmers to plant their seed if it's effective, if it's working, right? Well, that's what a demonstration plot does. That's how seed companies grow, is they demonstrate that it's worth it. It's demonstrating that it's fruitful. That's what churches are supposed to do, in my estimation. We plant the seeds of the gospel, and we just show the world what the gospel looks like, transformation and the kingdom of God. And if it's compelling, then it spreads. I don't think we have to do like hostile takeovers, if that makes sense. You know, the church is not like we're going to take that hill over there. The church is we're going to put a way of life on display, and if people find it compelling, then that's how the gospel spreads.
Right. I mean, that's absolutely what I see in Jeremiah 29. And you mentioned, you referenced in your book where Peter will talk about in his letter, you know, live as exiles in the world. You know, and so we started to unpack that a little bit this Sunday. And during my message, I stepped on a landmine that I'd love to hear you maybe like...
you want me to step on it too?
Yeah, I want you to step on it too. And I think it is because it is a polarizing issue, but I think, you know, and we can have opinions, I think, depending, but how do we, like, let's take the topic of immigration. How do we bring peace? How does the church as a community bring peace in that? What does that look like?
On immigration?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think what I would say is I would hope that as the church if we were to read many of the metaphors the New Testament uses to describe what it means to be a Christian or to be the church, a metaphor that is, an immigration metaphor is pretty common. Mm-hmm. So strangers, aliens, foreigners, exiles, those are all immigration terms. Those are all immigration metaphors. And the point of that is not to make a, 21st century U.S. politics statement exactly, but it is to say that the entire identity of a Christian is one where you are displaced from true home. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so I am living in a place that is not familiar to my quote-unquote home country. Does that make sense? And so that doesn't make them my enemy, but the customs and the values and the practices of everything around me is different than the place that I'm a citizen of. And so I guess a question would be, am I supposed to assimilate to the culture around me just to like get along? Of course not, right? The point of being a Christian is actually to hold true to the culture and values and practices of my home country, the place that I am a citizen, in order to put that on display in this place that is not my home. I think that is actually one of the main reasons why the New Testament writers use those metaphors.
Yep. Because
the temptation is to assimilate and to become like everybody else. And by continually reinforcing the sort of immigrant status of the church, this is not your home, you are a citizen somewhere else, do not assimilate. That's the overarching notion. So I guess, it should cultivate a little bit of sympathy. Mm-hmm. and possibly some like proactive care and hospitality towards folks who are not from the United States, when we recognize that they're living the exact same reality in concrete terms that we're living in what we might call spiritual terms, right? And so this like tension and discomfort that we feel as Christians trying to figure out what it means to live the Jesus way in this new place. Every single immigrant that lives in our country is trying to figure out what it means to live where they're from, like person they are, the place they're a citizen of, in this new place. That's a jarring and disquieting way to live in the world. That's not easy to do. And so when you hear a bunch of people shouting sort of rhetoric at immigrants, I think the first response should at least be compassion, empathy, and hospitality, because we should be some of the first people that know what it's like to live in that sort of jarring way.
Right, and I think along with that is, and one of the things I mentioned is understanding the story. You can't just put it all in one basket, right? There's a story behind each individual that would be seeking a place to better themselves, to better their life. And so, like, what is our response? So along with that, just understanding how we become a people of peace, in our conversation, you reflected that we cannot speak peace unless we have a disposition of peace. What do you mean by that? What does that look like?
It's a great question. The way that I would say we can do I'm going to try to get back to this answer, and if I don't answer it well enough, just tell me that wasn't good enough. We can do a lot of good in the world, just tangibly, right? We could create a lot of really excellent programs. We could give away a lot of money. We could help a lot of people who are in need. And we can do all of that and keep ourselves at arm's length. Now, I can do a lot of good in the world and be totally unchanged as a result. In fact, there are entire movements of social change that sort of bank on that idea. And actually, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all these like giant billionaires, when they think about philanthropy, this is how they think about it. They think that their dollar, they want to give it in the most effective and efficient way possible. So the best return on investment, whatever it is they're trying to do. So if they're trying to make a lot of money in their business, it makes sense that they would do that. They think the same way philanthropically. So when they give their money, they're like, how's this dollar going to make the most impact? And a lot of times that might be like, okay, so, and somebody's made this argument, the most impact that I can make is mosquito nets in Africa. And so every philanthropic dollar that I give away, I'm going to give to organizations that are putting mosquito nets up in Africa. But guess what? If my neighbor needs help, morally, I have to tell them no, because that's less efficient, right? The most efficient use of my dollar is going to be to send them all over there, okay? Now, I can send all that money to Africa and be unchanged. I can still be a total jerk. I'm just like doing my thing. What I can't do is care about my neighbor and be unchanged. And this is my argument, and what we were talking about, what does love look like in action? This is my primary argument. This is one of the reasons why I think the message of Jesus is so compelling, is that Jesus, when he's, love one another, love your neighbor, love the stranger, love your enemy, all of those things change us along the way. Wow. We cannot remain distant from love. When we demonstrate love to those closest to us, like we have an obligation. I think that's what Jesus is saying. It doesn't matter who it is, proximity and relationship matters. And when we show love to people who are close to us and that we're in relationship with, it will change us. So, your question, how can we as the church demonstrate the peace of God, the shalom of God's kingdom, if we aren't willing to be that way ourselves? I don't think it is possible for churches to make long-term, meaningful transformation in their communities unless they are churches committed to becoming that kind of people as a group and each of us individually. So if I want to see broken things put back together, I have to be willing to offer up to God my own brokenness. You know what I mean? We don't want to stand at arm's distance from the stuff that we want to see happen in the world. Does that answer the question?
Oh my gosh. Better than what I had thought you were going to say, actually.
I didn't know what I was going to say.
I'm sure that it occurred to me, but maybe it didn't, because I was thinking of like, what do we need to do in preparation? But what I hear you saying, it's actually no, immerse yourself in it, and it will change your life, and you are transformed. That to me is just brilliant. That is brilliant. One of the things I should have said at the very beginning, this is an all skates, so we want to make sure we give everybody opportunity to ask questions or provide input, and a little bit, Katie will be available to, kind of bring the microphone around. So if you are like, maybe some of you are holding back and saying, I really want to respond to that, I really want to ask a question. And by the way, as a ground rule, this is not about like confronting the, whether you agree or disagree on an issue. It's really about trying to understand how do we respond well as Christ followers. That's what we're talking about. And so I want to invite you here shortly. I'm going to ask another question, and then after that, just kind of open it up a little bit. And would love to hear from you. But one of the things, so I'm going to jump to another question. Yesterday, I was talking with Kenny Almanza, who was our intern this summer. He invited himself to be our intern, so that's like, who does this? It's like, give some time. And he delivered a fantastic message on the prodigal son a couple weeks ago, and has been a part of our young adult conversations. He's just fantastic. But one of the things that he brought up to me, which I thought was really good, he just kind of was reflecting. We were talking about pastoral counseling, actually, so it's kind of a side thing. And in regard to that, he was thinking, how do you approach, like he was thinking of it from a Hispanic standpoint, that in a Hispanic culture, they think community more than they do individuality. That for him to, he's always going to tell, and we know his mom, so he's always going to tell Tidy, where he's going to be and what he's going to be doing, and we're concerned about, if somebody needs a car in the house, then we've got somebody else that is taking care of it. Where us, I think, sometimes in our U.S. culture, is individual kind of thing. Well, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and figure out how you're going to do it, And that's not to say you're not compassionate or anything, but just the way we think. We live in the United States. We have the Declaration of Independence. We've talked about that a little bit this year. But within that culture, it's more of an interdependence. So I say all of that to just kind of go to the idea of community, where I think about where we want to go as the Living Stones Church. That this is not about doing things individually. We're doing something as a community. We want to understand how do we live like Christ in the world as a community of people? How do we bring healing into our city? And you've talked about this a little bit as well, the church as a community of healing. What are signs a local church is becoming that? What do you see?
What are signs the church is becoming?
Yeah, becoming that kind of healing presence in our community. And some of that could be like even the experience that you've had in the local church that you're at, and maybe even the experience that you've had with us here. We're striving to do that.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Two thoughts. One really fast, and it's the same answer that I had before. I don't think churches can be presences of healing in a community unless the church itself is a place where people are experiencing and talking about how we are being healed. You know what I mean? That's not something we can keep at arm's distance. So that's the first thing I think is the case. And so then just a one thought and a story that I'll share that's like one way that I think I got it wrong that hopefully would be instructive. But I think about how Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about the way the body is meant to come together, the actual physical body. And if you've read this, and it's very familiar. If you've been in church a long time, super familiar. but it's talking about all the different body parts and how they're supposed to work together. And there's two things that I think are important there. One is he talks about how the eye could say to the hand, I don't need you, right? And so the idea there, of course, is that the eye is a pretty self-important part of the body, like pretty obviously so. But if you're obviously important and you're telling parts of the body that are maybe less obviously important that you don't need them, then you are destroying the body's ability to function healthily, okay? So when sort of quote-unquote obviously important parts of the body aren't doing that, when they're recognizing how much we need everyone, I think that's a sign of the body being healthy, okay? Similarly, Paul talks about in that passage parts of the body that are not obviously important, the parts that are like dirty and gross, the parts that are most likely to be hidden, and I'm not going to get the exact way that he phrases it, but the point is that those parts of the body often feel shame as part of the body. They don't feel like that they belong, okay, that they should be covered up, or different things like this. This is the idea. So you've got these two poles, the people that know they're important, quote unquote, and the people that think they are totally worthless. But what Paul is saying is actually the parts that everyone thinks are worthless are the parts that should be treated with special honor, I think is the way that he phrases it. Treated with special honor. That's the second part of what I'm saying. It's not just the important folks, but like when the folks that, quote unquote, aren't important, like have seats of honor in a community, like that to me is a sign that this little expression of the body's got it figured out. Nobody sits up too high, and no one's allowed to like live out their own shame, which is actually how the world sort of treats so many people. So a church that is a place of healing is probably going to start with the invitation for the important folks to like get off the high horse and come be part of the body, and for folks that try to hide to recognize their inherent dignity and beauty and value and worth and come be part of the body. So when everybody gets to be part of the body, that's the healing. So I'll tell you, so lots of metaphor there. Here's how this happens. I was part of a church that had a big food pantry ministry. And when I say big, I mean it was probably the size of this room in terms of square footage. It was huge. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people every month were coming through. And part of my job was to, kind of oversee outreach things. And it was always a concern to me, like, how do we do this in a way that honors people? How do we do this in a way that doesn't make them feel more shame for being in need of this ministry right now? That was a big concern. And so actually the ministry was set up in some really interesting ways, I thought. A lot of folks, it was sort of set up like a grocery store, and there wasn't, it wasn't just like prepackaged bags, like here you go, that everybody kind of knew each other's names. It was a little bit of a community, and I really thought that was beautiful. And what we tried to do over time, because not everybody from the church could participate in that ministry, so you try to tell stories like that, right, to help people see like, oh, this is what we could be doing. And so on Sundays we would talk about this ministry, and we would say, in social service situations, a lot of times I might call them clients, or they might call them visitors, or I don't know, like what do you call somebody that shows up to use the food pantry? And so the church made the decision, as opposed to those kind of cold and stale terms, that if you came to visit the food ministry, you'd be called a guest, which is sort of a sign of welcome, right? And so I thought that was really good. And so we'd be telling these stories about how in this food ministry, God was at work in the lives of all of these guests, and isn't this great that as a church that we could welcome them here? I don't remember how long into my time of being a pastor at this church that I had this realization that one day, so I was tasked with sharing a particular story, and I was really, sort of giving it the whole college try, talking about everything that God was doing in the lives of these guests. And a bunch of guests were in the church. So I'm super excited that a church could create a food ministry where somebody from off the street might come in and get some food, and find their way into a congregation. And I'm mortified by the idea that you would find a home in a place that you're now part of the body, and you're being called a guest when everybody else is at home at their church. So this is the body not working in a healthy way, right? Because this idea that I'm talking about of like folks at the far end being welcomed in and people recognizing the way that they might already be self-important, like I got to stand on a stage with a mic and I'm telling the lowly folks that they're guests in the church that I'm part of. That we didn't get right. And I think so being even down to the very minute details of how we even talk about what we are doing in the community. Any way that we're creating us's and thems. It doesn't even have to be, this is somebody that I knew and loved, like I was part of their son's funeral. I like presided over it. Like I loved them and still did that. And so there was no ill intent, but just so how far you have to go to sort of root out that us and the community divide.
It takes a significant culture shift for us to be able to think that, you said the us and them thing is, I think we've kind of described it as trying to be a parish church. In other words, the story of every individual that is in our neighborhood, right, is part of our story. How do we make that happen so that they don't feel like they're being singled out as like you said, guests, which is kind of a, that's, it's still not part, but it's not negative, like right. It's not saying them or something like that. I have to relate a little bit because you mentioned the garden, the Unity Garden. Katie and I were out a couple weeks ago doing some things in the garden in the churchyard. We just kind of had a light week, so we're out there, and you wouldn't believe if you like hang out in our garden how many people come to our garden. Like you don't know. And so I've just been kind of meeting, want to meet them and record them. And I'll just tell you about Shirley. She came by. I went up and introduced myself to her, and we talked a little bit. And she talked about how she has some health problems and things like that. But when it's cooler, she gets out in the garden, and she takes vegetables to another friend of hers. This is her story, who is struggling with a some kind of a brain disease. It's terminal. It's going to take her life, but I'm caring, in my need, I'm caring for her. Like, what a beautiful story this is. And they're not even, they are a part of our community, right? She lives in Southmore. But she said to me, can I come and weed the garden? And if I come to weed the garden, where can I put all of the stuff? Like, can I just put it over in the dumpster there? And you may have seen her because she'll come sometimes on Sunday morning. Yeah. And I'm just thinking, you're a part. It's just like she's inviting herself to be a part of that, even though she's not attending Sunday services. That means that she's not a part. And that's something for us to just think about. It's like, oh my gosh, she wants to be a part and a contributor, like a participant, somebody who is not only by word a part, but they are actually a contributor and a participant wherever they find themselves, right? So I love what you said. That is just beautiful, and I think that's one of the things we want to strive to be. So let me open it up. I have a couple more questions that I'm glad to ask, but we would love for everybody in the group to participate, whether it's a question or a reflection or anything like that. So have at it. Who would like to talk? I knew you would, Gary. I knew you would.
Thank you very much for being here. It's on, yeah, okay. Two things. One is that this last week or so or more, I just came again to a realization that I have blind spots when I'm talking to people. And so when you were mentioning about to be a Christian, and has unity in that and following Christ's way, part of the thing going through my head is, even when I'm with other quote-unquote Christians, what each one thinks is being a Christian is different. And sometimes certain words I say or certain words they say trigger each other. So, and the main point I'm going to make with all of this is that I wish it was so simple, and it's not, in a way. So that's just one point, is that it's tough sometimes, especially if you're talking about a church having a direction when maybe the members inside the church don't have the same idea of what the direction ought to be. And on one hand, the more exclusive you are, then the more you can have a single-minded church and move. But the more inclusive you are, the more that can be difficult. So that's that one thing. And I probably just forgot about the other while I was talking, so I'll leave it at that.
If you think about it again, did you want to respond to that at all? That's very interesting.
Well, I mean, I think your insight is spot on. We all have, as you say, blind spots, but I think maybe the other way to say it is we all have stories that have profoundly shaped the way that we see the world. And so when we come to conversation and we aren't willing to recognize that your experiences and your stories and the things that you know, your perspectives, right? That's shaping everything that you're saying. If I'm not willing to acknowledge that, then why would I expect, or why should I expect anybody would acknowledge that being true of me as well? I think that's a good point. I also think that something I was pondering with the sort of polarized time that we live in, trying to, as a church, wrestle through how do we be the church in the United States right now when it is this fraught and in some ways gross. That's really hard to do unless you've been practicing on a lot of really small things. That'd be like the equivalent of me saying, like, tomorrow I'm going to go climb Mount Everest. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not at all equipped to do that today or tomorrow. There are hikes that I should take between now and then. There are things that I need to do to, like, get in shape so that when Mount Everest is there, I'm ready. And I do think that sometimes we talk about polarization, and in higher ed we talk about civil dialogue all the time. I think we talk about that in ways that make it seem like we ought to be able to just apply a tool to the most difficult conversations that we could possibly have. So unless we are figuring out how to come to the table and discern what the Spirit is guiding us to do in seemingly insignificant things, things that maybe we are all actually on the same page with already, it's going to be really hard when it's a challenge. I also think that very rarely when someone asks Jesus a direct question did he give them a direct answer. So that kind of annoys me, if I'm being honest. But especially when the teachers of the law were like, well, who is my neighbor? What did he do? He told him a story. And this Good Samaritan story has no clear one thing, right? Unless, like, people are getting jumped outside, which can happen, right? But aside from that, applying the Good Samaritan story to everything that we're doing in the world as it relates to what it means to love our neighbors is actually pretty hard to do. I have to believe that that was on purpose. The sense of, like, as a community, we're going to understand that discernment is never cut and dry, that we have to rely on the Spirit, and oftentimes the Spirit is speaking to us in the form of the people that we're sitting across the table from. So I appreciate what you're saying. I think that's right. Having said that, I do think your point about blind spots would say when we're trying to do that, confessing that we have blind spots and maybe don't know what they are helps us, even if you don't say it out loud, it just helps you to be a little more open-handed, like, where am I not seeing clearly, you know?
Hey, Adam. So you mentioned return on investment. So churches historically have just measured giving and attendance. Yeah. We've been called to impact the South Side. So I struggle with if you should have a metric, and if so, like, how do you even measure what that looks like?
we're literally talking about this at work all the time right now. Here's where I get caught, right? So if my job is to spread the gospel as a Christian, I want to share my faith. Am I more effective if I've led 15 people to the Lord or 5? I'm not convinced that 15 means I'm more effective than 5. And I also know that in saying that, you're all going to just dismiss me as sounding like a crazy person because 15 is more than 5. And I think about this. I'm not going to tell you the book because it'll sound like I'm trying to be mean, but working on a project right now, and return on investment is this key part of what I'm wrestling with. And the guy in the book says that a business executive matters more than a stock clerk, and it's ludicrous to pretend otherwise. That's almost a direct quote. And I think I'm not sure that I can get on board there, except that his point is, well, a business executive, has more influence. A business executive can make decisions that trickle down into the lives of more people. Somebody who's, like sorting mail, or if, they're putting stock on the shelves in the supply room. That person doesn't have that kind of impact. And I guess that I want to be open to the idea that, when Jesus takes a little something that somebody has to offer and makes something incredible with it, like a few loaves of bread and some fish, and feeds, right? He didn't need a big return to create his own return, I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. The other thing that I would say is, like, how do we know that the 15 people that I lead to the Lord is more impact than the 5? Because what if those 5 all lead 15? And you know what I'm saying? Like, return on investment from a kingdom of God perspective can be so narrow in terms of the time of, like, kingdom history. Like, God can do way more with what we plant in the ground than we can imagine. And so there's part of me that wants to say that I would much rather think about stewarding what's been entrusted to me than worrying about the return on the investment. The parable about, the owner that gives the money to the 3 servants, and some of them get a return, and one of them, like, buried it and didn't do anything with it. The only person that's condemned there is the person that buried it. The person that got the bigger return isn't commended more than the person that got less of one. But it's because they stewarded what was given to them. Like, the owner gave them something to put into practice. And then the owner was like, great, that's what I asked you to do. So you'll notice I have not responded to your question. Preamble to say, when we discern that our job is to make an investment on the south side, we want to see kingdom fruit come from that. But I actually think, I guess maybe what I'd say is, what if it was, we want to invest what we've got on the south side and trust that God's going to bring the return, and be rigorous in assessing how faithful we are in stewarding what we've been given, rather than how many people or dollars come in as a result. The first church that I was a pastor at had a ministry, and one of our leaders wanted to shut it down because over 5 years, only 2 people had come to the church. And I kind of wanted to shut it down, but not for that reason. I just didn't think it was very interesting ministry. But it has always stuck out to me because it actually was creating a little community of people that found some Christian-oriented belonging, some folks that really had trouble, like, being part of regular communities. They just weren't part of our church. And so, like, to say, well, I'm going to shut this down because only 2 people have come to the church, just is kind of a narrow way of thinking about it, So if I invest in one low-income entrepreneur, I don't know what kind of impact that's going to make over the long haul of that person's life. Is that a better or worse investment than running an entrepreneurship class for 50 people? I don't have a way to answer that. Unhelpful, I know.
Oh, quick follow-up question. Who should be starting quarterback for Notre
Oh,
Dame?
CJ Carr,
Okay.
100%.
I remembered my second question or point, and Lowell, your story reminded me of that, is that through the whole time I've been here, some of the most inspiring things have been when people came up and told a story, a testimony or whatever. And the value I see in that is we talk about what Christianity is, what God's Word is, but when we have little stories that show that in action in real life, that helps those who are learning to understand better what those words mean. And Lowell, your story about the lady that wanted to help garden, I think that is a very, very powerful statement about what relationship and Christianity should be like. And so occasionally, or as you hear things, because part of the thing is this church does a lot of things for the number of people it has. But most of us, and I'm not much of a participant, so there could be great communication, and I'm just ignoring it and not seeing it. But at least from my perspective, is I'm not aware of all the good things we're doing and all the stories out there. And this is not to brag for ourselves or for the church, but if we have stories that have a practical example in real life of what Christianity looks like and what the fruit of that is, I think that's another teaching method the church could use.
What, and this is a question for everybody, what does it require for us? Like if we need to hear the stories, we have, like you said, I don't know all the stories, but the stories are important. In my opinion, those are the greatest metrics, because that's where you find life transformation. But what does it require of us? What needs to happen in our body life in order for that to happen? Maybe less preaching from me. I'm fine with that. But seriously, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I have an idea, but.
Okay, and again, just continue on before I hand it off and shut up again for a while. As difficult as that is for me, that if we're aware that we're interested in those stories, and something happens and we have a way to raise it to the elders or to you, and then you can filter through or whatever, and if you see one that you think is particularly inspiring or good or has a lesson there, you could tell people about it from the pulpit or whatever, or we could have something on our site app or whatever to share those stories to make them aware. But the idea there's communication. Something happens to me, and if I think it happens to everybody else or nobody else cares, then I'll keep it to myself. But if something happens that I think, wow, that's really great, and I share it, then we can share it with the congregation. And part of that is I don't want, or somebody else doesn't want to brag or have the light shine on or whatever. And what I'm thinking about in particularly is, I'm horrible because he was a very, very good friend of mine. One of the elders that went down south.
Randy.
Yeah.
Randy Templeton.
Okay, so there's a story, a miracle that happened in this church. His wife was diagnosed with cancer, and they double-checked it. And she went to surgery. And when they went in there, there was no cancer. The congregation got together and prayed for her. They went in. Doctors don't know how or why it happened. But I rarely heard about that story, and yet it would be one of inspiration to some other people. Your story, as someone just coming in and wanting to participate by weeding the garden, seems very small and very little. But again, it's this story of us being open and the community being drawn in, and us sharing as a unity, not as an other coming in with us. So those are the type of things I'm thinking about when I brought that up.
Yeah, brainstorm that. That's great. Brainstorm that a little bit. How else? What else? What does it require? I keep looking over here because I'm thinking, Charlie Morgan, tell us what you think. Go ahead. Kim.
I love when Gary talks because in all the rambling, he makes sense. Which brought an idea to me. I know. How do we become and make Samaritans who aren't afraid to jump in, who aren't afraid to see something in order to do something? I think that's the biggest problem that we have, is people right now are too afraid to get involved, to see something, or it's not done enough that they're comfortable with reaching out and, weeding the garden or doing whatever you need to do. How do we do that? How do we make Samaritans?
Right. I think it's a really good question because it's outside of our comfort because we're not used to doing that. We think of church we have like a kind of a traditional way that we think of doing church, and this is what we do. And anything that is outside of that is uncomfortable because we're not used to that. I'd love for you to respond to that.
I don't know. This is a gut reaction, and it might connect a little bit with your question, Jeff, and that is to say, what are we putting on the demonstration plot? What are we putting on display? Like what is going to convince the South Side that the kingdom of God is worth it, right? And I think God wants people to flourish, right? I think God wants neighborhoods to thrive. I don't think that's just like become a Christian so you don't go to hell. I think that's like God is putting the pieces back together, and that's happening now. And so I guess a starting question would be like, well, what would it look like if our neighborhood was really flourishing? I'm sure that's a question that has been asked here. And what would it take for a church to contribute to that? And there's two things. One, you need way more skills and gifts and experiences than like pastor people. You know what I mean? Like in the scheme of things, like it's a very small part of this. But building a flourishing neighborhood takes the skills and gifts and talents, because what's involved? Housing and food and jobs and education and, you know what I mean? Like, what are all the things that you need to be a thriving, flourishing person in a community? And so I don't have all those skills. And so if we want to be people that are like, bandaging the wounds of our community, you know how many different ways there are to do that? You don't have to know the things that I know, because we won't get very far if it's just like a couple of, Bible verses here and there. Like, we need way more than that. And I have found that when people realize that to participate in good, like, kingdom work, I can actually bring my skills in finance, or I can bring my business skills or my education experience, and I can do things that I already know how to do, the fear level goes down. But if you think, okay, I spend all of my days helping people think about their mortgages, but to be a servant at church, like I have to go and spend time with all of the little kids, like I'm out, right? That's not my gift. Well, what if I was able to bring my gifts to bear, right? And I think sometimes in ministry settings, we think, oh, well, they don't want to do that. That's what they spend all their time doing. Well, actually, what better thing is there to do than to be like, I'm really great at this, and I can apply this to something that my church wants to be a part of? So this, like, how do we know if we're being effective, to me is a question of, like, what are the ways that we're thriving and flourishing, and are those growing? But when we do that, we're going to find all kinds of ways that we can lower the intimidation level for people to get involved.
I kind of want to jump off that flourishing idea. And I think this is where it takes some discernment on our part to even define what that means. Sure. Because we all have like an idea of what that can mean. And so take a case in point, we did the Miami Hills VBS with Judas Pride again this year. And we look at the community in Miami Hills, and we may judge what we see as not flourishing. But when we take our idea of what flourishing is from our concept, how difficult of a step is it to get to that, our ideal of what flourishing is, when we don't know the story of the single mom who has 3 kids in her home and dad is absent, and this is the story that has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. Maybe our idea of flourishing would be an impossibility. So discerning what flourishing could be, it's like the next step. Might not be our ideal, and it would cause us to rethink about that ideal. So I wanted to bring it around to a question that probably the one thing that you said probably hit the most for me in our conversation a couple of weeks ago is about discerning in the gray. That we think black and white. We think that if it's this, it's right. If it's this, is wrong. And yet, there's a lot more gray that is in there that it just doesn't fit, if that makes sense. So when you talk about discerning in the gray, maybe that will help us to understand flourishing and many other things. Unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, I don't think human flourishing is a binary situation. It's not like I'm flourishing or I'm not. I think it probably lives on a spectrum, and it's probably all different types of things. And so, the mom that you're talking about, to me, when I'm thinking about how can we contribute to flourishing, I'm thinking about how do we remove or lessen vulnerabilities, right? So it's not like I don't know that we could say perfectly this is what flourishing looks like. I think it's a little bit easier to identify vulnerabilities or threats. And so what are things that make flourishing difficult or challenging? And that I can have a conversation. I don't have to decide for anybody, but I can ask someone, what are the things that make it hard to thrive right now? And you might find some themes in a neighborhood or a community or an apartment complex. You might find some common themes, and you could work on those things. But in general, what are the threats that's keeping a person from bearing all the fruit that they have inside them to give life to, right? And if we can start to peel back those things, now that can be super tangible, concrete, impact in the neighborhood kinds of things, right? If I don't own any assets at all, I'm economically very vulnerable. And so reducing vulnerability in a neighborhood where very few people own their own homes by working toward home ownership, that is a way to reduce vulnerability. And it just so happens it makes the neighborhood a little more stable at the same time, right? Now, if the question is a little more abstract, a little less concrete, I still think you're talking about the same things, right? When we were talking about the person who feels shame, who doesn't feel like they can participate in a community, that shame is a vulnerability. It's the threat to a person's capacity to flourish. And so, in a church ministry more traditionally, right, that's one of the reasons why we want to promote the notion of grace and forgiveness and restoration and redemption, is because we don't think anybody should live on the hidden side of shame, because that gets in the way of their capacity to flourish and thrive and produce fruit and all of that. Does that make sense? So I think if you're thinking about flourishing, you don't have to separate between spiritual and tangible if you're just well, what's getting in the way? And how do we pull that weed if we're going to keep our metaphor going?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for that. I love the clarification of that, just trying to, remove the barriers that keep that from happening. I think it's a better question. Go ahead, Alyssa.
To kind of pull from different areas of where we've been talking, there was the word obligation used earlier, for an obligation to love those around us. And I think as far as to pull from the stories aspect of it, but then also allowing the people that are surrounding us to come as they are, instead of having to know their story or have that expectation that they need to tell us their story before we help them. let's just erase all that and assume that we have all of the gifts and all of the Samaritans and all of the people that we need to reach out to those around us, and we see needs, say a house needs painted, or an elderly person needs help with their bills, or there's a family that needs food. And we have the means to do that. How do we approach those around us with love, without seeming overbearing or to put them off, or in the other aspect of, in a way to make them feel comfortable that they do want to accept that help. Because I find that as a parent, and also within my job of working at an elementary school, it's hard to, there's so many things that I want to do to help, but I also don't want to assume that the person I want to help needs my help. So how do you feel that you do that without crossing that boundary, I guess? How do you approach situations like that?
I don't think I do a very good job of that.
Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No, I think it's an important question, especially because I did use the word obligation. I do think that's true, but it can also turn into like, oh my gosh, if I don't help everyone, then I'm like letting my obligation go down. But then that's a really unhealthy way to live. My my wife said something to me. Somebody had said this to her, and I said that our kids are older, and this is a transition that I've been having a harder time than she, and that is that our parenting is moving from managers to consultants. I'm terrible at that. I think I'm a great manager. They at least know where they stand. I don't think I'm a great consultant, because what I think I know, I'm not saying I do know, I'm saying I think I know what is best for them all the time. I think I know what their right choice is. I think I know what flourishing looks like. And the more that I overbearingly tell them that, the more they're likely to like kick against it and all of that. And so trying to move to this like consultant mode where I'm actually not giving any thoughts until I'm invited in. I'm failing miserably, but I do think that's the thing. I think that is what tangible neighbor love also looks like. And that is because I don't want to draw distinctions. Like the normal human relationships between partners, between parents and children, between friends, those are the things that I'm like, okay, what are the dynamics that make those really healthy? And then how do I just replicate that with other people? I don't want there to be distinctions between those kinds of things. So if that's how I'm trying to parent, what I'm saying is when I think I know, I need to wait till I'm asked, and then I need to be sort of open-handed with what they do with that. So when we think about serving others, it's almost impossible to not be in that mode where we think we know. And so the check is probably to just be like, I'm just gonna wait till somebody asks me, and then I can offer my thought, but then I gotta be open-handed with it also, right? And so, one of the reasons I think that's true is because part of what it means to flourish as like a young adult is learning how to enact your own agency. And so that's true for everybody, right? Like I wouldn't want somebody to just control me and all of my decisions because they have a vision for my life, right? One of the hard parts about being a pastor, you got a vision for everybody's life. You just got to take it. So I do think that there's part of that. And so that I do think helps us not feel like we have to spend every dollar in our bank account painting everybody's house or fixing everybody's front stoop or whatever it may be. I think we can think about how do we translate this idea that like we're able to help if you want it, but also like we're part of this along with you, right? We don't have it all figured out.
And I think we've got to be careful that it's not like you're my project, right? That may be something that needs to be done, a house painting or something like that. But some of that comes out of, I think more natural comes out of relationship that we build. I was thinking about something that Gary said. I think, like, when I asked the question, what does it take? I think it takes a couple simple things. It takes time. Like, it's an undistracted time. I'm not so busy in my life that I can't sit with you and know who you are. And then I think also then just presence. How many times have we sat across the table from somebody and had a conversation and they're on their phone or whatever it might be, and it's you're not present in that moment. Yeah, you're giving me the time that you have, but you're not present. The thing about time and presence is that takes a lot of energy. That requires margin enough in our lives, and I think margin enough within our community that we do that we can't be so busy about doing the things that are like the churchy things that we do. I mean, think about the investment of energy that we do as a church, and as outreach oriented as we are as the Living Stones Church, I'm sure that 80% of our energy is focused, and maybe I don't know where I'm just pulling a percentage out of the air. 80% of our focus is what we do on Sunday mornings, right? And that's something to grapple with. I'm not making a critical comment. I'm just saying, that it could cause us then to reevaluate our energy so that we give people more margin, give our people more margin, disciple our people to have more margin to actually hear the story, to understand where the needs are, and not just the needs, but then how do we help that person to feel like they are a part, like they are also a contributor. You know what I mean? Gary, did you want to say something, Adam? Before you say anything, Gary? Adam, go ahead.
I guess I'm thinking about like some of the best friendships that I have are ones that I have to ask for help and they have to ask me for help. And so thinking about this person who came and asked if they could weed the garden, I actually think it may even be a precursor to, like, before we start just thinking about, this is how we guard from people being a project, like, ask for help. Anybody that is in the world has something to contribute. And so when we find a way that they can help, we can ask for it, right? That's hard to do, and it's a vulnerable space, like with my friend, to be like, I actually need you. So like churches that, not in a weird way, but just like, oh, you paint? Actually, we have this project. Could you, like, could we hire you to do this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and then all of a sudden you're in a different kind of relationship with people. I just think the more human you can make relationships, the easier it is for people to be honest about where they're at with us.
Gary.
And it's kind of saying the same thing in slightly different words, but the only advice I'd give is when we spot somebody and we think they have a problem, don't forget there's the rest of the person there, their whole life, their whole experience, their values, things they've been through. So as we approach people, approach the whole person and not just a problem that you think you're helping them with.
Well, I think that's one of the best ways to say it, Gary, like it's the whole person. Wow, you're not defined and your identity is not that need. Like, you have a name, you have a face, and you just happen to have this need, but you also have this that you can contribute.
Yeah, with their history, you may find out that they have a huge amount of stuff that deserves respect and honor.
Oh my gosh, treasure, buried treasure. Paul's got one, and then Carolyn after Paul.
All right, Adam, I'm coming with the hard one. Now, know this. I don't expect an answer, but I'd love to hear your response.
Okay.
A podcast I listen to, they grapple with a lot of the partisan politics and things that are going on today and how to deal with that from a Jesus-following perspective. And the question that keeps coming up over and over is, if I feel like somebody is hurting or pushing out the margins, do I still provide a seat at the table for them? How do you know if you're not in that maturity that you had mentioned earlier, where I can have this conversation and still be okay, and still try to show that hospitality, the radical hospitality that we see over and over again in the Bible. But I also know Jesus sometimes gave it to the Pharisees, and he opened up his table to the marginalized. And so I know, difficult question on the podcast I listen to. There's an author theologian, a pastor, and I'd call him kind of a regular guy. And none of them could come to an answer on it. So that's why I don't expect to hear an answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Not an answer. Not an answer, but it is something that comes to my mind. Every person has dignity that cannot be taken away, and that goes for the person doing the marginalizing, as hard as that is for me sometimes to recognize. And the reason why we have to say that as Christians is because we believe that every person is made in the image of God. Every person bears the image of God, and they bear the image of God before they are a sinner. That is fact. Now, we can mess that up. We can bear that image unfaithfully, okay? Now, to your point about this person is pushing that person to the margins. This person is not honoring their human dignity by pushing them to the margins. And this person is not honoring their own human dignity by acting outside of what God would have them do. Does that make sense? They're living outside who they're meant to be. And so not Adam, but like, we can stand in the middle of that, I'll call it injustice, and like celebrate that person's dignity and challenge this person to embrace their own in the same move, right? The move to recognize that person's dignity is an invitation for this person to like get their face right. And so that can be challenging at times, but I would say I often do not look at the people that are like sitting in this chair with that degree of compassion, right? Like I want to look at that person with compassion because that's not what you were made for. You weren't made for that. You were made to bear the image of God, and you're not doing it by the hate and the vitriol and the marginalizing of this person over here. But if I can do that, then I can, with compassion, say, you got to get your face right. And to me, that changes if my posture is different, then I can stay at that table. Now, if I hate that person, if I'm trying to defeat that person, if I'm trying to embarrass or shame that person, like, that's going to create, right? Now, it may create challenges within a local faith community. There's no doubt about that. I'm not saying that part's easy. But I do think that this idea of innate human dignity is part of it, because both people deserve to have their dignity on display, and it's not in either case. And so we can just like point that out and invite people in. Like the older brother, you talked about the prodigal son story. That was just Sunday? Last Sunday? Like part of that older brother thing to me is like when the father is like, would you just get in here?
Yeah.
Right? Like the good wine is in here. Like, why are you out there being bitter about this, right? The people that like foster this self-righteous bitterness, like, just like, we gotta invite them in, but but listen, don't bring that in here, right? You come in here, it's the party. So I think that's okay to like protect the community from that, and also still say you're welcome to come if you just like let that go.
I'm going to address this a little bit more this coming Wednesday as we have a panel of young adults kind of speak to that idea. Like, the idea of, why are my peers, or maybe even why do I feel like, why am I having a hard time being a part of a faith community? Because they see that kind of thing happening in the name of Christianity, pushing people off to the side. And I think it's something for all of us to be aware of, like even in our seat, like, okay, evaluate myself. Is my attitude doing that? And to also see, like you said, I love what you said, and you're invited to the party to come and celebrate. But we have to wrestle with that, and we have to wrestle with that.
Can I yes and that, though?
Please.
So I totally agree with you, and I think that every generation has its own version of that, like, radical independence that you were talking about earlier. Like, it's inbred in us to want to be the independent person. And, it might not look today like it looked in the 50s, but every generation wants to do their own thing their way. And it's not to tell everyone that they're wrong, it's to invite people into an interdependent community. And so I absolutely think that as the church, we push people away because of the way that we handle these kinds of situations. I think we err, and we have erred for a long time. And I think that sometimes as churches, we can like hammer that so hard that then we create a second bait and switch. We're like hammer, we're not self-righteous Christians, we're not any of this, and then we get people to come into our church, and then they realize that, like, discipleship costs you something, and they're like, wait, didn't you tell me that I could just totally be me, right? Like, no, you are welcome here, and also Jesus is like putting a call on your life to become a different kind of person. We don't have to be caustic about it. So, like, I totally 100% agree, and it is always a call to, like, let go of my own radical independence and to become part of something bigger than myself. Right. Does that make sense? Right. And I think that challenges maybe the modern vibe in some ways.
Yeah, I talked to a young man last Sunday. He's struggling exactly what you're saying. One went this way, one that way. They hammer at me. I'll give you his name on my way out. The other move that I saw was really great was when the woman came up to the podium there, and this is how we can educate ourselves, because I was guilty of what happened. And that was when she said that she wasn't going to listen to anybody tell her that it's different because she's a Christian. That was Ava, I think her name was. And he hit home that all of us want to be, I heard the phrase, we just want to be included and loved. And if you've got somebody telling you that you're way out here, that one that doesn't matter, and you want to be included and loved,
Sure.
The pressure as a young person, I'm not going to talk about it so much, even though I believed in God from the day I was born, because my parents raised me that way. So I believe that to start with, we got to find out what we're capable of helping people with, and if we don't know, we say to the person, I don't have an answer for that. I've already given your name out a couple times. I said, go talk to Lowell. Or else I say, I'll find out and let you know. And we've had sessions that have done that for us on abuse and stuff, for example.
Right.
But we need to put that all together so we know that we have a young group that is willing now to not be badgered and to be part of the group. And them saying maybe this, Mark could have said, hey, if you want to be in the in group, you be my Christian group. Yeah. I was around town for a while, but I never heard of a young Christian group of from different churches coming together and going out as a mass and spreading the word. I've never heard it. And I would say that you're exactly right on the point. There's a lot of confusion out there right now as to what is and what isn't within the church.
Thank you, Mark. Very much. Carolyn?
I was just going to share, when Gary was wanting a story, when we were talking about communities flourishing, some feedback that was shared at the end of the VBS at Miami Hills was that in April, the South Bend Police took Miami Hills off their nuisance list.
Yeah.
And so that might seem like a low bar, but when you're Miami Hills, that's a big accomplishment, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes we need to realize, well, what went into that? And they have a manager who cares deeply about her residents,
Yeah.
and she knows them personally, and she will identify needs and address them. And, she has been just a beautiful force to be reckoned with out there. I don't know her well, but the little I've observed her, I'm very impressed. And then I think Judas Pride has done their share of trying to build relationships and build trust and to build on the strengths of the people who are there. There's a faith community in those walls that haven't always had an opportunity to express themselves or to feel welcomed or to feel valued and validated. So, and then just another comment. At one time I worked in a job where it was called a Young Moms Self-Sufficiency Program, and we worked with moms between 16 and 24 years old. And it was very rewarding, and time again I would tell the moms that they were my heroes, and the resilience they showed was just phenomenal. But what the key to it was, we were asking them what they wanted to work on. And I remember one woman in particular had a list of like 15 things. And when we got to the bottom, she was ready to start over again and start another list.
Wow.
And, but it was her things that she wanted to address. It might have been childcare, maybe gain a job, going back to school. It was a whole array of things, getting more organized with paperwork that she had. One time we just sat down on her floor, and she had 5 children, and I had file folders, and we put kids' important documents per child in a file folder. But I just say that as an example of meeting people where they are and allowing them to, share what would help them, what would be meaningful for them to work on, and how can we come alongside you and, maybe share resources that would be of help.
Absolutely. I think it's all creating that community space where people are heard and valued. I
Well,
want
we
to
have
ask
about
one more
5
question.
minutes.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask one more question from Adam as we get ready to leave. And if you could challenge our congregation with one question or practice as we step into this, trying to live like Jesus at home, in our neighborhood, and in the church, what would that be?
Lowell told me he was going to ask this question, and I didn't have a good answer. But one of the things that I really appreciated about, we were here about a year, and one of the things that I really appreciated about this church was true of a lot of folks that I met when we lived in Chicago before we moved here. And I would say this a lot, that I really liked visiting churches that, like their pastors had gravel in their shoes. And by that I mean, like, you could tell they walked around their neighborhood, knew people's names, and they like actually knew the streets and like where the intersections were and like who lived where and their stories and that sort of thing. And I was really struck by that here, was that there was a real desire to do that and a real like put that into practice. I thought that was really, really commendable. And one of the things that I often think about is how hard it is to be a church in a neighborhood because of all of the like barriers and blocks. It's different. I think it's better. I would much rather be a church in a neighborhood than a church like way out somewhere that everyone has to, commute to or something like that. So I think it's good. But one of the challenges is like I live in a neighborhood that's got a neighborhood church, and I'm pretty pro-church, and I get annoyed when the people are like prayer walking my street. Is that okay? Can we cut that part out of the recording? Here's why. It has nothing to do with them. It has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with what I would be thinking if I was standing where they are, and that is that the person that lives in this house is not a Christian, and they need the Lord, and we have the Lord, and we're here. Like, this is bad. This is bad. I shouldn't be thinking this. But it's so easy to do that, and I'm like, I want to be like, open my door and just like, come ask. I've got lots of, we can talk. Like, we're together, but that doesn't ever happen. It's this like disconnected thing. Now, I have always said I think it would be really cool if a church had a map of the city and actually walked every sidewalk of their city or of their neighborhood and like just like charted it, like drew the lines and like, yeah, we walked this whole thing. And it's not because I think we need to be out there, 20 people wide and like doing prayer walks on every corner and all that. If you want a prayer walk, you should do it. I'm not. But the idea that you could have a vision for your neighborhood and not like have gravel in your shoes is pretty hard.
Wow.
You know what I mean? I think that's a hard thing to do. And so the challenge there is I think this is a church that's already doing that kind of stuff. And the challenge is just don't make the kinds of assumptions that I think I would make if I was doing that, right? About all these houses, how desperate they are for the Lord. Like, there's a lot that we can be about in a community, but it's going to take like getting to actually know them, know folks' stories. We actually may learn quite a bit from the other, like you're talking about. The stories of resilience coming out of Miami Hills ought to make us take our shoes off because it's holy ground, not think, what can we do for those folks? Does that make sense? Like, I think that's such a great way to frame what you just said, the stories of resilience. I think it's wonderful. So I don't know if that's a challenge. It's just to say that, like, what I noticed about this church, what I know to be true about this faith community, like, keep doing it, but also keep looking for ways to, like, bridge that divide.
I think the challenge actually encourages us to renew that, because I think sometimes, like, and we've acknowledged this, like, we're in new days, and we kind of have to rediscover who we are. And there have been a lot of things that have precipitated, like, where we are now, and we've owned it. And so, but sometimes when you're in that time of renewing, you kind of fall back into just kind of survival mode. And you can forget, and the gravel just kind of gets shaken off. And I'm not saying that we're not, but I'm saying for me, it's convicting that to get back to the roots of that and to get to know our neighborhood even more. I think that's huge. So that is a good challenge and a good reminder. So thank you for that. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming tonight. We appreciate. I appreciate your friendship and the conversation that we'll continue to have. I know you invited us. We've got to figure out a way to work, do some collaboration together in the future. I know we're in different neighborhoods, but learning what other people are doing in different neighborhoods, it helps us all to be better. And so I thank you for that. Let me go ahead and offer a closing word of prayer, and then you're welcome to hang out and chat a little bit more. Father, thank you so much for our congregation, and especially, Father, for the call that you've placed on us to be an influence, a light, beacon in this neighborhood on the south side of South Bend. And I'm thankful, Father, for those that are here tonight that are leaning in and saying, I want to know how to better do that. I want to be a part of this mission. I believe in that. I thank you, Father, so much for Adam and the ministry that he does within his neighborhood, within his family, and the work that he does at his church and the influence that he has through the university all of these touch points, Father, and the way that he has inspired us and encouraged us. I pray, Father, your blessing upon him, and that you would continue to use him as a voice that will carry out that kingdom vision and mission. I pray, Father, that as we go from here, that you would just give us eyes to see, a renewed vision, a more inspired vision, Father God, that we would just be aware of the people that we come into contact with, and that we would not only see the opportunity that we have, but when we look into the faces of every individual in our neighborhood, every individual that we come into contact with, we see the image of God in them, and that we would draw that out of them. Father, thank you for your love for us that continually reminds us that we are your beloved sons and daughters. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.